light, dim the streets in moonlight bright. We dissect the cinematic art, real by real we pull apart.
Alright, welcome back everyone to another episode of Real Talk. I'm your host, Josh, and today we're talking about a film that's kind of hard to pin down. 2014's The Falling, directed by Carol Morley. It's one of those movies that has a little bit of everything. It's a coming-of-age drama, it's got a touch of psychological horror, and it's set against the backdrop of a British girls' school in the 1960s. And if you've seen it, you know that while it is eerie, it's also deeply emotional and full of teenage angst. It's a film about a group of girls who start experiencing these mysterious fainting spells. But what's really fascinating is how it weaves in themes of friendship, repressed sexuality, and all the complicated layers that come with adolescence. Now don't get me wrong, this film has some amazing moments. The cast is top-notch, especially with performances from Maisie Williams, who you might know from Game of Thrones, and Florence Pugh, who's really been making waves the past few years. They really bring their characters to life in a way that feels raw and vulnerable. And that's a big part of what keeps you hooked, even when the narrative starts to feel a little fragmented. But here's the kicker. It's one of those films that, for me, kind of missed the mark. It has this unique, mysterious vibe that I couldn't help but appreciate. But at the same time, there was something about the pacing and the way the story unraveled that just didn't quite land. And that's what I'm going to get into today. Why, despite all its potential, The Falling didn't quite hit the heights I thought it could. Let's talk a little bit about how The Falling fits into the coming-of-age genre, because this film definitely has its place there. Coming-of-age stories, as we know, have been around for ages. But I think what sets this one apart is how it taps into not only the growing pains of adolescence, but also the complexity of female friendship and identity during a time when those things weren't always openly discussed. It's not just about a girl growing up, it's about a girl figuring out who she is in a world that's full of societal pressures. It's almost as though the film is peeling back the layers of what's expected of women during that time, especially in a space like a girls' school, where the lines between friendship, jealousy, and competition can get dangerously blurred. And here's something interesting. The Falling is a part of this growing wave of women-directed films that are breaking away from the typical narratives we're used to seeing in mainstream cinema. As I mentioned, directed by Carol Morley, who's known for her work in both documentary and fiction, this film feels like an exploration of how emotion, particularly the emotion of young women, can be both liberating and destructive. It's like you're watching these girls burst into the world of womanhood, but in doing so, they end up confronting these powerful, overwhelming emotions that have been suppressed for so long. Now, as we go through this episode, I'll be diving deeper into some of the themes, how The Falling explores the fine line between emotional liberation and destruction, how it looks at female friendships and their darker sides, and what happens when suppressed emotions finally find a way to break free. I think those are the things that The Falling does really well, but also where it could have pushed a little harder. So stick around, because we're going to unpack a lot of what makes the film so intriguing and where it kind of trips over itself along the way. So let's just get started. Before we dive into the intricacies of The Falling, let's talk about Carol Morley, the woman behind the film. Morley made a name for herself by exploring the emotional complexities of women, especially those on the margins of society, or those whose stories are often overlooked. She's one of those directors whose work isn't afraid to go deep into the messy, uncomfortable parts of life, particularly when it comes to the inner worlds of women and girls. Her previous film, 2011's Dreams of a Life, was a documentary that told the story of a woman named Joyce Vincent, who was found dead in her apartment after years of living in social isolation. According to critics, it's a powerful meditation on loneliness, identity, and how someone can fade from the world without anyone noticing. Dreams of a Life is about uncovering a life that's been forgotten and giving voice to someone who was rendered invisible by society. They say that the documentary gives us a taste of Morley's signature style. She doesn't just show you a person's story. She digs into their emotional core and forces you to sit with the discomfort of their reality. Now, The Falling, on the other hand, was Morley's first fictional feature. And while it is a very different beast, you can still feel the traces of her documentary approach here. She's still focused on the emotional rawness of her characters, particularly young women, and the way their internal lives can be so complex and mysterious. This film is all about exploring the secret worlds that teenage girls inhabit, those friendships that feel all-consuming, the desires they can't quite understand, and the way the emotional and physical worlds of adolescence can collide in terrifying ways. The Falling is steeped in the same sense of looking beneath the surface, but this time with a fictional narrative that plays with the surreal and the eerie. And interestingly enough, the film was partly inspired by Morley's own experiences at an all-girls school, where she felt the emotional weight of those friendships and the subtle pressures placed on young women in such a controlled environment. So for Morley, The Falling is a very personal exploration of female identity, desire, and the way those things can erupt in unexpected, often destructive ways. And if you've seen her earlier work, I haven't, but according to the critics, it would be easy to see how she could be drawn to a story like this. She's fascinated by what's hidden beneath the surface of people's lives, especially women's lives. Now, real quick, let's take a look at the cultural backdrop against which The Falling was made. When it was released in 2014, it came at a time when the film industry was seeing a noticeable rise in films that gave voice to women's stories, especially those that focused on the complexities of the female experience, from the mundane to the mystical. I mean, you had films a couple years later, Lady Bird, around the same time, The Diary of a Teenage Girl and Blue is the Warmest Color, movies that explored the emotional intricacies of women's lives, often in ways that are raw and uncomfortable and intensely personal. While The Falling didn't break into the mainstream the way some of those films did, it was part of the larger movement in cinema, where the internal worlds of women were finally being given the attention they deserved. And you can see The Falling as part of that wave, tackling things like female friendship, sexual awakening, and the complicated dynamics of adolescence. But I think what sets it apart is how it wraps all of that in a slightly more mysterious, almost gothic atmosphere. There's an eerie, surreal quality to the film that adds a layer of psychological tension. 2014 also marked a time when there was a broader cultural movement around gender and identity that was just starting to gain more momentum. The Me Too movement was still a few years off, but there were growing conversations about the way society treats women, especially young women, and how their emotions and bodies are often seen as something to control or police. And The Falling taps into that cultural moment where the issues of the female identity and freedom were beginning to be discussed more openly. The film touches on themes of repressed desires and mystification of female bodies, and how society often overlooks or misinterprets what teenage girls go through emotionally and physically. In that sense, The Falling is very much a product of its time. It's a film that speaks to a period when female filmmakers were gaining the visibility and the conversations around women's roles in society were evolving. But while it wasn't a huge success, it did carve out a space for itself in the conversation about women in cinema, offering a unique, sometimes unsettling, take on coming-of-age stories. Now, I don't know that it really achieved cult status in the same way as some other films from this era, but it's definitely one that continues to resonate with audiences who appreciate its raw emotional complexity and unsettling atmosphere. So while The Falling might not have become the breakout hit some expected, it did capture something important, a reflection of the growing presence of female voices in filmmaking, and a meditation on the intense, often hidden emotional lives of young women. It's a film that feels very much of its time and timeless in its exploration of the emotional turmoil that comes with adolescence. And that's why it is worth revisiting, even 10 years after its release. At the heart of The Falling lies this bizarre and unexplained fainting epidemic that grips an all-girls school in the 1960s. This isn't some random medical mystery. No, it becomes a symbol for something much deeper. The story is told through the eyes of Abby, played by Maisie Williams. Abby's world is turned upside down when her best friend, Lydia, played by Florence Pugh, suddenly dies under mysterious circumstances. This sets off a chain of events that's both tragic and in some ways oddly beautiful. The two girls shared a deep and incredibly intense connection, one that's borderline obsessive, which is the emotional core of the film. As Abby struggles to cope with Lydia's death, she starts to experience her own fainting spells, just like the rest of the girls at the school. Now, the fainting isn't just about physical collapse, it's a symbolic breakdown. It's a way for the body to express the emotional overload of being young, of grappling with your identity and your desires in a society that's constantly telling you to hold it all in. Abby's fainting becomes a visual metaphor for how repressed emotions and confusion about sexuality bubble to the surface in ways you can't control. And that's really what this film is about. It's about those emotions spilling out in the most dramatic ways. Now let's talk about Abby and Lydia. These two characters are really the lifeblood of the film, and they couldn't be more different. Abby is the more introspective, quieter one. She's kind of stuck in Lydia's shadow, unsure of who she is outside of their relationship. She's definitely more reserved, even though she's clearly deeply affected by Lydia. There's this beautiful tension in Abby's character. On the one hand, she's trying to break free from the hold Lydia has on her, but on the other, there's this undeniable pull that she feels towards her. She's at this crossroads, struggling to define herself, without Lydia's larger-than-life presence constantly overshadowing her. And then there's Lydia. She's everything that Abby isn't. She's bold, rebellious, the total embodiment of freedom. And she's the kind of character that you almost envy as a teenager. She says what she wants, does what she wants, and it seems like the whole world revolves around her. She's not afraid to push boundaries, especially when it comes to her body and sexuality, something that makes Abby both drawn to and intimidated by her. Lydia she's like a spark. She lights everything up, but also burns everything in her path. The intensity of their friendship, which is really more of an obsession, is both beautiful and suffocating. It's like the kind of friendship that's so tight and all-consuming that it becomes impossible to tell where one person ends and the other begins. And that's the thing. Sometimes these kinds of deep emotional bonds in adolescence don't just feel like closeness. They feel like you can't breathe without that person. The dynamic between Abby and Lydia highlights the complexities of growing up. It's not just about discovering who you are, it's about realizing who you are without someone else in your life. And I think that's exactly what Abby has to grapple with. The whole film really explores that, how friendships, especially the ones that are as intense as Abby and Lydia's, can be beautiful, can be heartbreaking, and ultimately can be suffocating. And the line between love and possession can feel very thin when you're a teenager. The Falling dives into that feeling head first. Then we have the supporting cast, who provide a crucial backdrop for the story. Characters like the headmistress and the girls' overbearing mothers serve as constant reminders of the pressures and expectations these girls face. The school itself, with its stifling rules and oppressive atmosphere, feels almost like a character in its own right. It's a place that doesn't allow room for emotional expression or self-discovery. Instead, it expects the girls to conform, to sit quietly in their desks and hide their desires. And when those desires can't be contained, they manifest in these fainting spells. A physical breakdown of the emotional strain of trying to see or to be what the world wants you to be. And then something that sort of sets The Falling apart in a good way is the way that Carol Morley tells this story. By focusing on the lives of the young women, The Falling brings a fresh perspective to the coming-of-age genre. And not just that, it does so through this lens of mystery and psychological tension that you don't typically see in this kind of film. It's not just about growing up, it's about growing up in a world that tells you that what you're feeling and what you're experiencing isn't quite right. The film's exploration of female friendship and sexuality is both complex and unflinching. Morley doesn't shy away from portraying the messy, raw parts of being a young woman, especially when it comes to navigating your body and desires in an environment that is both sexually charged and heavily repressed. And the fainting itself, as a symbolic element, adds an eerie, unsettling layer to the story. It's not just a physical symptom. It's a way for the girls to express the tension they're holding inside. There's something beautifully tragic about how they're unable to control it. In a way, their bodies are speaking for them, making visible the emotional turmoil that's otherwise invisible in everyone around them. And that's a huge part of what The Falling is all about. The film is about how these young women struggle to contain their emotions and their desires, only to have them explode in these uncontrollable ways. It's a powerful metaphor for adolescence itself. The struggle between wanting to be yourself and the pressure to conform to something that feels foreign. And in a lot of ways, The Falling doesn't give us clear answers. It leaves us with a sense of unease, of confusion, much like adolescence itself. But there are no easy resolutions here. The film doesn't give us a neat little bow to tie everything up in. But I think that's part of what makes it hauntingly effective. So there's so much going on in The Falling when it comes to its core themes. And it's a movie that doesn't just want to tell you a story, but also asks you to feel something. The themes are all about the struggle for identity, freedom, and what happens when those things get bottled up. when your desires, your emotions, and everything that makes you gets repressed by society, by the people around you. So at its heart, The Falling is about the turbulence of adolescence, a time when everything feels like it's either too much or not enough. You've got all these intense emotions, desires, and questions about who you are, and it can feel like you're in a pressure cooker. For the girls in this film, that pressure gets turned up even more by the world around them, particularly the institution they're in, which, as we mentioned, is an all-girls school in the 60s. The school is a microcosm of the larger society they inhabit, a place that insists on traditional gender roles where emotions are either overlooked or labeled as hysterical or dangerous. Now, one of the key themes the film explores is gender, and specifically how society, represented by the school and the adults, views and controls the experiences of the young women. The fainting spells that strike the girls in the story, particularly Abby, are not just the physical phenomenon, but a metaphor for how their emotions, especially around identity and desire, are often dismissed, trivialized, or misinterpreted by the older generation. It's as though the girls' emotions are too much to handle, so they're physically taken out of the equation. The adults don't know how to cope with what's happening, so they chalk it up to something beyond the girls' control, like mass hysteria. It's a pretty powerful commentary on how society tends to sideline women's experiences, especially when they're too emotional or too unruly, something that resonates even today. But the film also plays with the idea that these fainting spells are a form of rebellion. For Abby and her friends, the fainting is a way to express something that can't be said out loud. The frustration, the confusion, the repressed feelings of sexuality and identity that are bubbling up but have no real outlet. The way the girls start fainting seems almost like a cry for help, but it's also like an act of defiance, a way of asserting control over their bodies in a world that constantly tries to control them. And this is especially true for Abby, who's deeply affected, as we mentioned, by the death of her best friend Lydia. Abby's attachment to Lydia is intense, and the film makes it clear that it's more than just a close friendship. The bond between them is about desire, longing, and a need for connection that goes beyond what society deems appropriate. In the context of a 1960s girls' school where same-sex desire is still taboo, this relationship is fraught with emotional and sexual tension. Even though it's never explicitly acknowledged, the film doesn't need to name it, because it's there in every interaction. The fainting, in a sense, becomes a way of the girls trying to escape the heavy weight of their feelings. But it's also a signal that there's something deeper that the adults are just too uncomfortable to address. What I find interesting here is how the film builds on this idea of repression and the eventual explosion of those feelings. The older generation, the ones represented by teachers and parents, has this suffocating presence. They're constantly reinforcing traditional gender roles. You've got the headmistress, who represents the stifling authority of the institution, and the girls' mothers, who hold expectations for them that they're struggling to live up to. But in their own way, the fainting spells push back against the control. The more the girls are told to suppress their emotions, the more those emotions fight back in physical, uncontrollable ways. And this tension between repression and liberation is at the core of the film's genre of drama. The girls are at the point in their lives where they're trying to assert their autonomy. And the film makes it clear that their path to self-discovery is never going to be easy. It's going to be messy, confusing, and painful. And that's something that I think we can all relate to. especially when you think back on your own adolescent years, when everything felt like it was either too much to handle or not enough to give you a sense of who you're supposed to be. Now let's talk about some of the imagery in the film. The falling really starts to hit you on a visceral level with some of these images. One of the most striking symbols is the water. There's a sense with Abby, the scene where she's submerged in the pond, and it's haunting and powerful. It's one of the film's most memorable moments. Water here isn't just water, though. It represents the emotional depth. It's as though Abby is diving into her own feelings. The feelings she can't express, the turmoil she's carrying beneath the surface. Being submerged in water is symbolic of the emotional depths these girls are struggling to navigate. It's also a visual metaphor for drowning in your own emotions, the way Abby drowns herself in the grief of losing Lydia. Water, in this context, also speaks to how fragile the girl's emotional state is. They're teetering on the edge of something. There's a sense that they could be overwhelmed by it at any moment. It's an interesting juxtaposition, the cool, calming image of water that is also the thing that could pull them under. It reflects the chaos they feel inside, how something as simple as a pond can become a symbol for something much darker, much more complicated. The girls are caught in the flood of emotions and that they can't fully control. And then the physical act of fainting also plays into this imagery. When the girls collapse, their bodies literally fall, almost as if they're losing control of themselves. The act of falling in this way can be seen both as a literal and a metaphorical collapse. It's not just a physical event, it's really a representation of how overwhelmed these girls are by their emotions, how much they're carrying within them. They can't stop the fainting, they can't stop their own emotional growth. Their desires and their internal struggles that come with adolescence will keep happening. They can't stop it. And there's a sense of inevitability in the way the girls fall. It's as if their bodies are rejecting the constraints placed on them, or trying to escape from something that's been weighing them down for far too long. The fainting spells become a way of both letting go and asserting some form of control in a world where they have so little. The themes and the symbolism here make the film rich and layered that works on an emotional and psychological level. Because it's not just about what happens to the girls in the narrative, but it's also about the deep emotional currents that are flowing just beneath the surface. The water, the fainting, the repressed desires, all of these elements come together to create a film that's about the complexities of being a young woman, about navigating the chaos of adolescence, in a world that really refuses to acknowledge the emotional and sexual depth of your experiences. It's a film, I think, that could resonate on a personal level because of its heart. The Falling is really about that struggle to be seen, to express yourself, and to survive the overwhelming forces of identity and desire that come with growing up. It's messy, it's raw, and I think it's something we could all connect with, whether we experienced it, if you're a girl that experienced it, or if you have girls like myself and watch them struggle. I think we can all relate to that. Let's talk about how The Falling landed when it first came out and where it stands now in the larger conversation about film and culture. The reception was definitely mixed, and honestly, I can see why. This isn't the kind of movie that neatly ties everything up in a bow. It's more like a puzzle that's missing a few pieces on purpose. Some people find that intriguing, others just find it frustrating. Now, when The Falling hit theaters in 2014, it sparked a lot of conversation, particularly among critics. On the one hand, you had those who praised it for being this strikingly atmospheric and deeply emotional exploration of adolescence. Critics pointed to Morley's ability to create an unsettling mood and highlight the often overlooked emotional complexity of teenage girls. The performances, especially from Maisie Williams and Florence Pugh, got a lot of love. Florence Pugh, by the way, was making her film debut here. She was just 18 years old and already commanding the screen in a way that hinted at the superstar she'd become. I mean, talk about a foreshadowing, right? But not everyone was on board. Some critics felt like the film's ambiguity, its refusal to spell things out, was more frustrating than fascinating. The pacing was another sticking point for some, and let's face it, The Falling is a slow burn. It takes its time. It lets you marinate in its weirdness and tension, which can be great if you're in the mood for that, but torturous if you're not. One reviewer even described it as beautifully made but emotionally hollow, which I don't entirely agree with, but I get it. This is a film that demands a certain level of patience and a willingness to sit with its questions, even if the answers never come. Audience reactions mirrored this divide. Some viewers were captivated, drawn in by the haunting imagery and the emotional intensity of the characters. Others, though, found themselves scratching their heads and checking their watches. It's one of those films where you're either drawn into its dreamlike quality, or you're left feeling like maybe I missed something. Now, looking back almost a decade later, where does The Falling sit in the grand scheme of things? Well, I'd argue it's more important than it might seem at first glance. No, it didn't achieve blockbuster status, and it's not exactly a household name, but it carved out a niche for itself, especially within women-directed cinema and the coming-of-age genre. What makes it stand out is its focus on female friendship and its eerie, almost supernatural tone. It doesn't shy away from the messiness of teenage relationships or the darker side of growing up. And it does all of this while centering the experiences of girls in a way that's raw and honest. That's something we didn't see as often then. Even now, it's rare for a film to dive this deeply into the emotional and psychological lives of young women. In a way, The Falling feels a bit like a precursor to some of the trends we've seen in indie horror and psychological dramas in recent years. When you think about films like The Witch or Saint Maud, movies that combine unsettling atmospheres with a deeper dive into the inner lives of their protagonists. While The Falling isn't horror in the traditional sense, it shares that DNA of using discomfort and misery to explore something much deeper. It's almost like Morley was ahead of the curve in blending the psychological and the surreal. Another thing to consider is how the film fits into the broader movement of women gaining more recognition in the director's chair. Around the time of The Falling was released, there was this growing momentum for female filmmakers telling stories that were their own. Films that didn't cater to traditional narratives or male gazes. And The Falling is very much a part of that wave. It's a movie that feels like it was made without compromise, for better or worse. And honestly, even when a film doesn't hit every mark, I think there's value in its existence. It pushes boundaries, it challenges norms, and it can open the door for more stories like it. Now, here's the thing. The Falling may not have been a massive hit, but it does have all the ingredients to eventually become a cult classic. Maybe not for me, but it has that weird, niche, haunting quality that can stick with you. And those are the exact qualities that often lead to a film finding a dedicated audience over time. I wouldn't be surprised if years from now people are revisiting this film and talking about it as an underrated gem. Part of that is thanks to its cast. Florence Pugh's star continues to rise. More people are going to go back and check out her earlier work. And this is where it all began. And Maisie Williams, coming off of all the Game of Thrones fame, is always a draw. And between the two of them, there's a good chance this film will keep popping up on other people's radars. So while The Falling didn't exactly set the box office on fire or get showered with awards, it's quietly made its mark. It's a film that'll challenge you, may frustrate you, but it lingers with you. And it's the kind of movie that gets better, I think, the more you think about it, or maybe the more you talk about it with other people. And I think that's part of what makes cinema so powerful. Not every film needs to be a crowd pleaser or to be meaningful. Sometimes it's the ones that divide us, that make us wrestle with our feelings, that leave the biggest impression. Okay, so let's dive into what makes The Falling significant. This is where I really want to take a step back and reflect on why this film matters, even if it didn't fully hit the mark for me. So The Falling is a film about the complicated emotional landscape of young women. And let's be honest, adolescence for anyone is messy, but there's a special intensity when it comes to young women. And Morley captures that intensity in a way that feels raw and occasionally unsettling. And this movie is less about fainting spells and more about what those spells represent. The girls in the story are dealing with emotions that they don't fully understand. Grief, longing, identity, the desire for connection. All of that is amplified by a society that doesn't give them the tools or the freedom to express themselves. The repression they face, whether it's cultural, emotional, and sometimes even physical, it ends up manifesting in their bodies literally. It's like their emotions are bursting out in the only way they can. And that's such a poignant metaphor for how young people, especially girls, can internalize their struggles when they don't feel seen or heard. And let's talk about the time period for a second. The 1960s was a time of cultural shift. But for many young women, especially in conservative environments like the one depicted here, that shift hadn't reached their world yet. These girls are still living in a system that values control and conformity over any individuality or self-expression. So in a way, the film is a rebellion against that control. It's saying these emotions matter, these experiences matter. And for a modern audience, there's a lot here that still resonates. I think one of the more striking things about the film is how it can speak to the ways young women experiences are often dismissed or misunderstood even today. And let's face it, we've come a long way in terms of representation and understanding, but there's still this lingering tendency, especially from men, to downplay the emotional lives of girls and women. If they're upset or acting out, they're too dramatic. If they're quiet and internalizing things, they're mysterious or distant. There's often a lack of nuance in how we as a society interpret the struggles, especially of young women like this. And the film reminds us that those emotional lives they're valid and worth exploring, even if they're uncomfortable or hard to understand. And honestly, isn't that the beauty of art like this? I mean, it pushes us to sit with the discomfort, to lean into things we might usually shy away from. Another takeaway for me is how The Falling handles grief and friendship. The relationship between Lydia and Abby is so central to this story, and it's a reminder of how intense friendship can be, especially at that age. It's not just about companionship, it's about identity. And these girls are defining themselves through each other, and when that bond is shaken, it feels like the ground has been ripped out from beneath them. And that's a universal experience, even if it doesn't always manifest in something as dramatic as the fainting epidemics. I think something else that stuck with me is the way The Falling challenges us to think about repression. And not just as an individual issue, but as something systemic. These girls aren't just dealing with their own personal struggles, they're navigating a world that has already placed limits on how they can be and how they can express themselves. And that's a message that's timeless because, let's face it, those limits might look different today, but they still exist. And then there's the beauty, I think, of how the story is told, the way there's the mix of the psychological horror and the coming of age drama. It's a very unique blend, and it gives this film a haunting quality. And the fainting spells, the tension in the relationships, the eerie atmosphere, I mean, it all kind of works together to create a mood that feels both intimate and unsettling. Now, is The Falling a perfect film? No, I mean, at least not for me, but I do think it's one of those movies that will stay with you because it is trying to say something important. It's not afraid to dive into the messy, complicated emotions of adolescence and explore them in a way that's both honest and unsettling. And though it didn't fully land for me, I have to respect what it's aiming for. It's a film that feels like it was made with purpose, and for me, that's worth celebrating. So whether you are someone who is drawn to stories about friendship, someone who loves a good metaphor-laden mystery, or just someone who appreciates films that take risks, The Falling has something to offer. It's not an easy watch, and it's not for everyone, but it's a film that invites you to think and maybe even feel a little differently. And for me, in my book, that's still a win. All right. Well, so here's where I land on The Following. My personal rating is it's a 6 out of 10. And let me tell you, this score feels like it's sitting on a tightrope. On one side, you've got the film's stunning mood and atmosphere. The visuals are haunting. The performances, especially by the leads Maisie Williams and Florence Pugh, are gripping. And Carol Morley really does create something that feels unique and bold. But on the other side, the pacing drags in parts, and the ambiguity. Now, a lot of films, I love ambiguity, but in this one, it's one of those cases where it feels like the film is just out of reach. You want it to hit a little harder, but instead it sort of leaves you hanging. Not necessarily in a bad way, but in a way that makes you go, I think I get it, but do I? I mean, now don't get me wrong. There is something undeniably fascinating about a movie like this. It's layered, it's thoughtful, and and it leaves room for interpretation, which is great if you're in the mood to unpack a film for hours afterwards. But if you're looking for something that ties everything up neatly, this one might frustrate you a bit. I'd still recommend it though, especially if you're a fan of moody coming of age stories with darker, almost gothic edge. It's a film that'll get under your skin even if it doesn't quite deliver the full emotional gut punch I was hoping for. That said, it is important to remember that films like The Falling, they're not just about entertainment. They are part of a bigger conversation about storytelling and about representation. It's rare to see a film that dives into female friendship, adolescence, and sexuality with this level of intensity and honesty. So even if it's not a personal favorite, I respect what it's doing. Now let's talk a little bit about what's coming up next on Real Talk. I'm really excited about this one. It's Celine Sciamma's 2011 film Tomboy. If you haven't heard of it, this is a beautifully subtle film about a young girl navigating her gender identity. It's tender, it's raw, and it's one of those movies that leaves you thinking about it for days. Sciamma has this incredible way of portraying identity and relationships with so much empathy, and I can't wait to explore that one with you. If you haven't seen it yet, now's the time to check it out. But before we wrap up here, let me ask you, what did you think of The Falling? Did the pacing and ambiguity work for you? Or were you, like me, left wanting just a bit more? I'd love to hear your take. And you can reach out through social media, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Real Talk. I'm on X occasionally at Real Talk Pod, or email the Real Talk, or just right where you got this podcast from. Leave me a comment there. I'd love to hear your opinions and keep the conversation going. And hey, if you're enjoying Real Talk at all, don't forget to share it with your fellow film-loving friends. It's always better when we watch and discuss these films together. Finally, if you have more suggestions for movies I should cover, whether they're classics, hidden gems, or even films that totally flopped, send them my way. I'm always up for exploring something new and unexpected. Alright folks, that's a wrap for today. Now I want to remind you, as always, to keep watching, keep loving, and keep those reels rolling. I'll talk to you next time.
Underneath the sunscreen, gleam, talking reels and all their schemes. Dusty scenes and dreams unfold, stories told in shadows bold. Gritty plots and whispers tight, dim the streets and moonlight bright. We dissect the cinematic art, reel by reel we pull apart. The real talk where voices play with velvet words and starlit sway, reviewing tales both light and dark, classic films that leave a mark. Dive deep